This delay is unacceptable. We need to board now.
Safety checks are mandatory, sir. We can't
Guys, you're costing us millions.
My decision is final.
The airline manager's voice boomed across the jet bridge as he pointed at Captain Alicia Morgan and ordered her to step away from the cockpit immediately. He claimed she wasn't qualified to fly the Boeing 777, that there had been a mistake in crew scheduling, and that a more experienced pilot would take her place. What he didn't know was that Captain Morgan had just completed a confidential FAA safety inspection of this exact aircraft 2 hours earlier and discovered catastrophic maintenance violations that could kill everyone on board, and the suited officials walking up the jet bridge behind him weren't there to replace her. They were federal investigators coming to arrest him for falsifying safety records and ordering pilots to fly unsafe aircraft. In the next 20 minutes, this manager's empire of corruption would crumble, while the pilot he tried to humiliate would become the whistleblower who changed aviation safety forever. If you're ready to see arrogance meet federal justice, smash that like button and subscribe to Echo Story, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Captain Alicia Morgan had earned every one of the 4 gold stripes on her uniform sleeves, through 15 years of relentless dedication to aviation excellence. At 39 years old, she was one of only 47 black female captains flying for major U.S. carriers, a statistic that reflected the industry's persistent diversity problem. Today she stood at the cockpit door of Flight 2847 from Denver to Miami, preparing for what should have been a routine cross-country journey. She had arrived at the gate 90 minutes early because she also served as a confidential FAA safety inspector, a role that allowed her to conduct surprise audits of aircraft maintenance and operational procedures. This morning's inspection of this very Boeing 777 had revealed violations so serious that she had immediately contacted her FAA supervisor to report them. The aircraft had been cleared to fly despite having hydraulic system pressure readings below minimum safety thresholds, backup flight computers showing error codes that hadn't been addressed, and maintenance logs with signatures from technicians whose certifications had expired months ago. Alicia had photographed everything and submitted her report, then prepared to fly the route as scheduled while waiting for FAA enforcement to arrive. The airline manager, Douglas Henley, was a career operations executive who had built his reputation on keeping flights on schedule and minimizing delays regardless of the cost. At 52 years old, he ran the Denver hub with an iron fist, pressuring maintenance crews to rush inspections and intimidating pilots who raised safety concerns. Douglas had spent the morning in an increasingly frantic series of phone calls after learning that an FAA inspector had submitted a damning report about one of his aircraft. He didn't know the inspector's identity, but he knew the aircraft was Flight 2847, and he knew it was supposed to depart in 40 minutes. When he arrived at the gate and saw Captain Morgan conducting her pre-flight briefing with the first officer, his prejudices and paranoia collided into a catastrophic decision. He assumed that a black woman couldn't possibly be qualified to captain a wide-body aircraft and decided she must be part of some affirmative action program that had let underqualified pilots into the cockpit. Douglas convinced himself that replacing her with a more experienced captain would somehow solve his FAA problem, demonstrating his commitment to safety and deflecting attention from the real issues with the aircraft. Douglas stormed onto the jet bridge where Alicia was reviewing the flight plan with her first officer, a competent pilot named Marcus Chen who had flown with her dozens of times. Douglas's voice carried the aggressive authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Captain Morgan, I need you to step aside from this flight immediately. We're making a crew change." Alicia looked up from her tablet, her expression shifting from concentration to controlled alertness. She recognized Douglas from various crew meetings and knew his reputation for bullying behavior. "Mr. Henley, I'm the assigned pilot in command for this flight. On what grounds are you removing me?" Douglas didn't offer an explanation, just doubled down with more aggression. "I don't need to explain my operational decisions to you. There's been a scheduling error and we're assigning a different captain. Gather your belongings and report to crew scheduling for reassignment." Marcus Chen looked between them with growing confusion. He pulled out his phone and checked the crew roster, which clearly showed Alicia as the designated captain with no changes or notifications. "Sir, there's no scheduling change in the system. Captain Morgan is confirmed for this flight." Douglas's face reddened. "The system hasn't been updated yet. This is a direct operational order. Captain Morgan, leave the cockpit area now." Alicia felt the familiar cold anger that came from being questioned and dismissed based on prejudices rather than qualifications. She had faced this throughout her career but had learned to channel that anger into calm, precise responses that left no room for ambiguity. Mr. Henley, I'm refusing your order on 2 grounds. First, there is no legitimate operational reason to remove me from this flight. Second, I have safety concerns about this aircraft that need to be addressed before anyone flies it. Douglas's eyes narrowed dangerously. He had been wondering who had filed the FAA report, and now he thought he had his answer. So it was you. You filed some bogus safety complaint to cover up your own inadequacy. I've seen pilots like you before, hiding behind regulations when you can't handle the job. Well, it won't work. I'm removing you from this flight for insubordination and questioning your fitness for duty. Passengers boarding the aircraft began to slow down and watch the confrontation, phones emerging from pockets to record the scene. Alicia maintained her professional composure despite the public humiliation Douglas was attempting to inflict. Mr. Henley, everything I reported to the FAA is documented with photographs and maintenance log entries. This aircraft has multiple safety violations and should not fly until they're corrected. T. Douglas made a show of pulling out his radio and calling for airport security, his voice loud enough to ensure the gathering passengers could hear him. Security, this is Henley at Gate B7. I need officers to remove an insubordinate crew member who's refusing operational orders and disrupting flight operations. He turned back to Alicia with barely concealed contempt. You're done, Captain. You'll be lucky if you ever fly for this airline again after the stunt you've pulled. Alicia pulled out her phone and made her own call, her voice steady and clear. This is Captain Morgan at Gate B7. The aircraft assigned to Flight 2847 has documented safety violations that haven't been corrected. The operations manager is attempting to remove me for reporting these violations and appears intent on flying an unsafe aircraft with passengers on board. She was calling the FAA emergency hotline, the same number pilots use to report imminent safety threats. Douglas realized what she was doing and tried to grab her phone, but Marcus Chen stepped between them. Sir, you need to back away from the captain. You're creating an unsafe working environment. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, with passengers now openly filming and posting to social media in real time. Airport security arrived within minutes, 2 officers who looked deeply uncomfortable about being called to intervene in what appeared to be a dispute between airline management and flight crew. The senior officer, a professional woman named Lieutenant Karen Shaw, approached cautiously. What's the situation here? Douglas immediately launched into his version of events. This pilot is refusing a direct operational order to step aside from the flight. She's insubordinate and is delaying departure. I need her removed from the gate area. Alicia handed Lieutenant Shaw her credentials along with her FAA safety inspector identification. Lieutenant, I'm a current FAA safety inspector in addition to my role as a captain. I conducted an inspection of this aircraft earlier today and found multiple violations that make it unsafe to fly. Mr. Henley is attempting to remove me and fly the aircraft anyway with 300 passengers on board. Lieutenant Shaw examined the credentials carefully, then looked at Douglas with new understanding. Sir, if she's an FAA inspector reporting safety violations, you can't just remove her from the flight. That's witness intimidation and obstruction of a federal investigation. Douglas sputtered in protest, but Lieutenant Shaw held up her hand to silence him. 3 men in dark suits emerged from the terminal, walking with the purposeful stride of federal law enforcement. The 3 suited men approached the gate, and the lead agent pulled out his badge and identification. Special Agent Robert Torres, FAA Office of Inspector General. We're looking for Douglas Henley, Operations Manager. Douglas's face went from red to pale in an instant. He had been so focused on removing Alicia that he hadn't noticed the federal agents arriving at his gate. I'm Henley. What's this about? Agent Torres gestured to his colleagues, who immediately moved to flank Douglas. Mr. Henley, you're being detained for questioning regarding violations of federal aviation regulations, specifically falsifying maintenance records and operating aircraft in an unsafe condition. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The Miranda warning continued as Douglas stood frozen in shock, unable to process that he was being arrested in front of his own employees and hundreds of passengers. Agent Torres turned to Alicia. Captain Morgan, thank you for your report this morning. Your documentation was extremely thorough and gave us everything we needed to move forward with this investigation. Alicia nodded professionally. I'm glad. I could help, Agent Torres. What's the status of this aircraft? Torres pulled out his tablet and showed her the official grounding order. This aircraft is officially grounded pending complete inspection and certification. We'll need to deplane the passengers and rebook them on other flights. The passengers who had already boarded began deplaning in confusion, many stopping to thank Alicia for preventing them from flying on an unsafe aircraft. A mother with 2 small children hugged her with tears streaming down her face. You saved my babies. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth. Alicia accepted the gratitude with professional grace, but inside she was processing the full weight of what had just happened. She had reported safety violations many times in her role as an FAA inspector, but this was the first time her report had led to immediate arrests at the gate. Agent Torres pulled her aside once the passengers had cleared. Captain, I need you to understand the scope of what you've uncovered here. Douglas Henley has been systematically pressuring maintenance crews to falsify safety inspections for the past 18 months. We've identified at least 37 aircraft that were flown with known safety issues that should have grounded them. He was cutting corners to meet on-time performance metrics and boost his bonus compensation. Your report this morning gave us the final piece of evidence we needed to move forward with criminal charges. Alicia felt sick thinking about how many flights had operated with compromised safety, how many passengers had unknowingly put their lives at risk. The investigation expanded rapidly over the following hours as FAA agents descended on the Denver hub and began pulling maintenance records for the entire fleet. They discovered a pattern of systematic fraud that reached beyond Douglas Henley to include 3 maintenance supervisors and 2 other operations managers who had been complicit in the scheme. Aircraft were being signed off as airworthy when critical systems were malfunctioning. Parts were being used beyond their certified lifespan to avoid replacement costs, and mechanics who raised concerns were being threatened with termination. The airline's corporate headquarters went into crisis mode as executives realized they were facing potential criminal liability, massive fines, and the complete destruction of their reputation. The CEO issued an emergency statement suspending operations at the Denver hub pending a complete safety audit, a decision that stranded thousands of passengers but was necessary to prevent potential disasters. News media picked up the story within hours, with footage of Douglas being detained at the gate going viral on social media. The narrative quickly focused on Alicia as the whistleblower pilot who had risked her career to expose corruption and prevent a potential catastrophe. Douglas Henley's arrest was just the beginning of his downfall. Federal prosecutors built a comprehensive case showing he had knowingly endangered passenger safety for personal financial gain. His bonus compensation was directly tied to on-time performance and operational efficiency, creating a perverse incentive to cut safety corners. Emails recovered from his work computer showed him explicitly ordering maintenance supervisors to sign off on incomplete inspections and threatening their jobs if they refused. In one particularly damning exchange, a mechanic had warned Douglas that an aircraft had hydraulic pressure problems that needed immediate attention. Douglas had replied telling him to defer the maintenance until the next scheduled service interval, and to annotate the logs as inspection complete with no issues found. That aircraft had flown 47 commercial flights with passengers on board before Alicia's inspection caught the violation. The potential for catastrophic failure during any of those flights was significant. Federal prosecutors charged Douglas with 19 counts including conspiracy to defraud, falsifying records, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice. His trial became a high-profile case that drew national attention to systemic safety issues in commercial aviation. Alicia found herself thrust into the spotlight as the face of aviation safety whistleblowing. She was invited to testify before Congress about the pressures pilots face to ignore safety concerns and the retaliation that whistleblowers often experience. Her testimony was powerful and specific, detailing not just the Denver incident but the broader culture of intimidation that existed at many airlines where operational efficiency was prioritized over passenger safety. She talked about the subtle and overt discrimination she had faced as a black woman in aviation, how managers like Douglas often assumed she was less qualified and more likely to make mistakes, and how that discrimination had actually worked in her favor during the inspection. Because Douglas had underestimated her completely, congressional representatives praised her courage, and several pledged to introduce legislation strengthening whistleblower protections for aviation safety inspectors. The FAA administrator personally called to thank her and offered her a position as a senior safety consultant helping to redesign inspection protocols across the industry. Alicia accepted, knowing she could have more impact on systemic safety from that role than from any single cockpit. The airline's corporate leadership faced a reckoning beyond just the criminal prosecutions. Their stock price plummeted as investors realized the company had been operating unsafe aircraft to boost profits. Class action lawsuits were filed by passengers who had flown on the compromised aircraft, seeking damages for emotional distress and endangerment. The Department of Transportation launched its own investigation into whether executives had knowledge of the safety violations and failed to act, which could result in massive fines and potential criminal charges at the corporate level. The airline's board of directors forced out the CEO and 3 senior vice presidents, bringing in new leadership with explicit mandates to prioritize safety over financial metrics. The new CEO's first action was to implement a comprehensive safety review of the entire fleet, grounding any aircraft with even minor discrepancies until they could be properly certified. This decision cost the company hundreds of millions in lost revenue, but was necessary to restore public trust. The airline also established a new whistleblower protection program with independent oversight, ensuring that employees who reported safety concerns would be protected from retaliation and their reports would be investigated thoroughly by parties outside the operational chain of command. Douglas Henley's trial took place 8 months after his arrest at Gate B7. The courtroom was packed with journalists, aviation safety advocates, and some of the passengers who had been scheduled to fly. On the aircraft he had tried to operate despite known safety violations. Alicia sat in the witness stand for 3 hours, walking the jury through her inspection findings with the same meticulous precision she brought to every aspect of her work. She displayed photographs of the malfunctioning hydraulic systems, read aloud from maintenance logs showing falsified signatures, and explained in clear language what would have happened if those systems had failed during flight. The jury listened with growing horror as they understood how close hundreds of people had come to disaster. Douglas's defense attorney tried to paint him as a mid-level manager following corporate pressure to meet performance targets, but prosecutors demolished that argument by showing Douglas's compensation records and his own emails ordering subordinates to falsify safety inspections. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 19 counts. The judge sentenced Douglas to 12 years in federal prison, calling his conduct a betrayal of public trust that could have resulted in mass casualties. Douglas stood in the courtroom looking diminished and broken, finally understanding the consequences of prioritizing his bonus checks over human lives. Marcus Chen, the first officer who had witnessed the confrontation at Gate B7, became one of Alicia's strongest allies in advocating for aviation safety reform. He testified at multiple hearings about the culture of intimidation he had observed during his career, where pilots who raised safety concerns were labeled as troublemakers and often faced career retaliation. Marcus talked about times he had felt pressure to accept aircraft with marginal safety issues because pushing back would delay flights and anger managers. He credited Alicia with showing him that speaking up was not just acceptable but morally necessary, regardless of the potential career consequences. Together, they worked with pilot unions to establish new protocols for reporting safety concerns that bypassed operational management and went directly to independent safety boards. Their advocacy helped shift industry culture away from the old-school mentality that captains should just shut up and fly whatever aircraft they were assigned. The new approach empowered pilots to be active participants in safety oversight rather than just operators following orders. Marcus eventually became a check airman responsible for evaluating other pilots, and he made safety advocacy a core component of his training program. The 3 maintenance supervisors who had been complicit in Douglas's scheme faced their own legal consequences. 2 accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against Douglas, receiving probation and permanent bans from working in aviation maintenance. The 3rd supervisor, a man named Richard Kowalski who had been with the airline for 28 years, chose to go to trial and was convicted of conspiracy and falsifying federal records. He received a 5-year prison sentence. During his sentencing hearing, Richard tried to explain that he had felt trapped between Douglas's threats to fire him and his own knowledge that what he was doing was wrong. The judge showed little sympathy, pointing out that Richard's expertise gave him a special responsibility to ensure aircraft safety, and that his decision to prioritize his job security over passenger lives was inexcusable. The mechanics who had been threatened by Douglas and his supervisors were granted immunity in exchange for their cooperation with the investigation. Many of them expressed relief that they could finally tell the truth about the pressure they had faced to cut corners. Several became advocates for better protections for maintenance personnel who identify safety issues, arguing that mechanics needed the same whistleblower protections that pilots had. Alicia's role as an FAA safety inspector became public knowledge after the trial, leading some to question whether she should continue serving in that capacity now that her identity was known. The FAA ultimately decided that her visibility could be an asset rather than a liability, sending a message to the industry that safety inspectors were embedded throughout the system and that cutting corners could be caught by anyone at any time. Alicia embraced her new public role, speaking at aviation conferences about the importance of safety culture and the responsibility that everyone in the industry shares to protect passengers. She talked candidly about the discrimination she had faced as a black woman pilot and how Douglas's assumptions about her qualifications had blinded him to the fact that she was also an FAA inspector. Her story became a case study in business schools and aviation management programs about the dangers of implicit bias and the importance of evaluating people based on their actual credentials and performance, rather than superficial characteristics. Alicia used her platform to advocate for greater diversity in aviation, arguing that different perspectives and backgrounds actually enhanced safety by ensuring that problems were examined from multiple angles and that groupthink was less likely to take hold. The passengers who had been booked on Flight 2847 that day never forgot how close they had come to potential disaster. Several formed a survivors advocacy group even though technically nothing had happened to them, arguing that they had survived because of Alicia's courage to speak up when it would have been easier to stay quiet. They lobbied Congress for stronger aviation safety regulations and better whistleblower protections, bringing the emotional weight of people who understood they owed their lives to someone who had prioritized truth over career security. One passenger, a software engineer named David Park, created a website documenting the entire incident and tracking the legal proceedings against Douglas and his co-conspirators. The site became a resource for journalists and researchers studying aviation safety and corporate corruption. David also started a scholarship fund for aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities, naming it the Captain Alicia Morgan Safety and Excellence Scholarship. The fund provided financial support and mentorship to young people pursuing aviation careers, with a specific focus on promoting diversity and safety-first culture. Alicia was deeply moved by the gesture and served on the scholarship selection committee, helping to identify candidates who demonstrated both technical excellence and ethical courage. The airline itself never fully recovered from the scandal. While the new leadership implemented genuine safety reforms and the fleet was eventually recertified after extensive inspections and repairs, the brand damage was permanent. Passengers associated the airline with safety violations and criminal corruption, preferring to fly with competitors even when it meant paying higher fares or accepting less convenient schedules. Within 2 years, the airline filed for bankruptcy and was acquired by a larger carrier that immediately retired the Air brand name. The Denver hub was downsized significantly as the new owner consolidated operations at other facilities. Of the hundreds of employees who had worked under Douglas's regime, many found themselves unemployed or transferred to other locations. Some struggled to find new positions in the industry because their former employer had become synonymous with safety failures. The mechanics who had been pressured to falsify records faced particular challenges, as their employment history raised questions about their integrity, even though they had been victims of Douglas's intimidation. Several spoke publicly about the long-term career damage they suffered because of Douglas's decisions, adding their voices to calls for better protections for workers who face pressure to compromise safety standards. Douglas Henley began serving his 12-year sentence at a federal correctional institution in Colorado, a dramatic fall from the position of power he had held at the Denver hub. Fellow inmates quickly learned about his crimes from news coverage, and Douglas found himself isolated and despised even in prison. The fact that he had endangered hundreds of innocent passengers, including children, for the sake of bonus money, made him a pariah. He was denied parole at his first hearing after serving the minimum required time, with the parole board citing his continued refusal to accept full responsibility for his actions. In interviews with prison counselors, Douglas continued to blame corporate pressure and industry standards rather than his own decisions to falsify safety records. His ex-wife, who divorced him shortly after his conviction, moved to another state with their children and changed their last name to distance them from his crimes. His adult son from his first marriage wrote a public letter disowning him and expressing support for Alicia and the other whistleblowers who had exposed the corruption. Douglas's legacy became a cautionary tale about the consequences of prioritizing personal gain over public safety. His name mentioned in aviation safety training alongside other infamous figures who had caused or nearly caused disasters through negligence or greed. 5 years after the incident at Gate B7, Alicia was promoted to Director of Safety Oversight for the FAA's Western Region, one of the highest-ranking positions in aviation safety regulation. Her appointment was celebrated by pilots, mechanics, and safety advocates who saw her as someone who genuinely understood the pressures of the job and would prioritize protecting lives over protecting corporate profits. In her new role, Alicia implemented systematic reforms to how safety inspections were conducted, creating more opportunities for confidential reporting and ensuring that inspectors had protection from retaliation. She established a mentorship program pairing experienced inspectors with new hires, passing on not just technical knowledge but also the moral courage to speak up when they saw violations regardless of the potential consequences. Alicia made a point of visiting different airports and facilities regularly, talking directly with mechanics, pilots, and ground crew to understand the pressures they faced and identify potential safety issues before they escalated. Her leadership style was characterized by accessibility and directness, refusing to hide behind bureaucratic layers and instead engaging personally with the people responsible for maintaining aviation safety every single day. On the 5-year anniversary of the incident, Alicia returned to Denver International Airport for the dedication of a new safety training center named in her honor. The Captain Alicia Morgan Aviation Safety Institute would train inspectors, pilots, and maintenance personnel on safety protocols and ethical decision-making using real case studies including the Flight 2847 incident to illustrate the importance of speaking up about safety concerns. Alicia stood at the podium during the dedication ceremony, looking out at an audience that included FAA officials, airline executives, pilot union representatives, and many of the passengers who had been scheduled to fly that day. She spoke about the responsibility that comes with every decision in aviation, how a single choice to cut corners or stay silent can have catastrophic consequences. She honored the mechanics who had faced pressure to falsify records but had ultimately cooperated with investigators, the passengers who had supported stronger safety regulations, and particularly Marcus Chen, who had stood beside her at Gate B7 when Douglas tried to remove her. Alicia's voice was steady and clear as she reminded everyone that safety is not just a regulatory requirement but a moral obligation that every person in aviation carries with them every single day. Today, Captain Alicia Morgan continues her work at the FAA while also serving as a sought-after speaker on aviation safety and ethical leadership. The reforms she helped implement have made commercial aviation measurably safer, with enhanced inspection protocols and stronger whistleblower protections preventing the kind of systematic corner-cutting that Douglas Henley had practiced. Douglas himself remains in federal prison, his earliest possible release date still years away, a cautionary example of how personal greed and prejudice can destroy lives and careers. The airline that employed both of them no longer exists. Its brand retired and its assets absorbed by competitors who learned hard lessons about the true cost of compromising safety. Marcus Chen captains international flights and trains new pilots on safety advocacy, carrying forward the lessons he learned watching Alicia stand her ground at Gate B7. The passengers of Flight 2847, the flight that never departed, lived their lives knowing they were saved by a pilot who chose integrity over convenience, who refused to be silenced or intimidated, and who proved that doing the right thing matters even when it cost you something. This story, shared with you by Echo Story, reminds us that real heroes don't wear capes or seek glory but simply refuse to compromise on what matters most. And that courage comes in many forms, including the quiet determination to speak truth even when powerful people order you to step aside.